Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Although today's review is a little bit different from the standard and it's a bit more than a review. You see, what I'm looking at today is the curious evolved USB cable. Some of you out there will strongly believe that a USB cable can make absolutely no difference to the sound. So before I even talk about the curious USB here, I want to share with you some data that I collected through the YouTube community over the last few weeks. First of all, there's a spoiler warning here. If you haven't yet seen the polls that I put up, there's 6 of them in total, and you want to have a chance to listen to the files, which are not just USB based, I should add, but if you want to have a go at the mystery test before you find out the results, go and do that now. I'll put a link through to the community page down in the description below, so jump through to that link, do the mystery test first, and then come back and watch this video if you're interested. The other disclaimers that I'd like to make are that it is a very, very small sample size. So we're working with a maximum of about 51 responses in one of the tests, all the way down to 16 in the most recent one, because I had to start recording the review before I could wait for more and more responses to come through. So recognize that it is a small sample size, but the samples do show similar trends to what I was expecting, although not always in the right direction. So sometimes I've gotten the opposite of what I expected, but as you'll see in a minute, what's been shown is still very valuable and useful for this discussion. Another limitation that I want to mention is that in order to create these tests, what I did was I took a signal from my PC playing back on Roon. That was then fed into the Chord Hugo TT2 and the M scaler, which was then output into my little Zoom H1N recorder, which is just down here doing the audio recording right now, so I can't show it to you. But the point being that it was running into a very basic recorder. My listening tests here after the fact showed me that listening to the original from the TT2 straight into my headphones sounded far superior than listening to the recording from the same exact setup. So in other words, the original file and the recording, even using the exact same setup, were different. And that tells me that the recording device, being a fairly cheap unit, has produced some compression of the overall sound and reduced the ability to separate differences between different files. That's not an excuse. It's also not saying that the experiment is completely flawed, because as you'll see, it has still provided some really interesting data. The other thing I wanted to mention is that everybody's listening to this on different setups, and that also brings its own variations to the experiment. It's not as though everybody's been able to come in here, sit down at my desk with my equipment and hear exactly what I'm hearing. And so the other thing that's worth noting here is that higher end systems tend to be more revealing of subtle differences in music than lower end systems. That's not to knock the lower end systems. I just want to point out the fact that some people who haven't heard differences may not have heard differences because of the gear they were using, as opposed to their inability to hear it, or because the differences weren't there. And that's where having a wider range of responses is helpful, particularly on those first few tests, whereas later on things get a little bit dicier as we get less and less responses. Either way, this is about starting a conversation. I hope you'll enjoy that conversation and then the review that follows up on the curious evolved USB cable. The first round of the mystery test had 2 files called track X and track Y. The results from this test showed that 22% of people preferred track X, 27% preferred track Y, and 51% heard no difference. What was actually going on here was that the track X was the stock USB cable, so just a standard black normal printer style USB cable, and the other track was recorded using the curious evolved USB cable. So what we can see here is that only 49% of people actually heard a difference between these 2 cables. Now this was really interesting to me, and I'll talk about it more when I get into the review of the curious USB cable, but what I noticed in listening to the curious evolved is that its tonality is not far different from the stock USB cable. It brings some spatial cues and better decay and note weight and elements like that to the music, but it doesn't drastically change the tone. So with this one, I was curious to know if this was an artifact of the recording process I mentioned before, compressing those spatial details that the curious evolved cable does better, and therefore making it harder to discern. So for now, let's just park this knowledge and see what the later test showed us, because I built in some controls to make sure we could cover this off. So when we got to round 2, this was one of the controls just to see how much people were actually hearing differences. In this case, the first track, which was track P, was preferred by 27% of people, and 28% preferred track Q. 35% heard no difference, so this one was really split, but what we can see here is that 65% of people did hear a difference. Interestingly, the two tracks being recorded here were both using the stock USB cable, so there was no change of USB cable. The only thing that changed was I upsampled using the M scaler for the first track, and I didn't upsample for the second track. The fact that we had 65% of people hearing a difference shows that we are able to hear differences, and the recorder was probably not causing a complete loss of difference between the tracks. But what it also showed me was that something was going on in the recording process, because when you listen to it live, the upsampled sound is consistently better, at least to my ears, consistently better sounding than the non-upsampled. So the fact that it was not coming across in the recordings tells me that the characteristics of the recording device were having some impact on people's responses to the music. Let's continue and have a look at round 3. So round 3 we had two tracks again, track D and track E. And this time we had a breakdown of 24% preferring track D, 38% preferring track E, and 38% hearing no difference. In this case, we once again had USB cables on the test, and what we had was the quite expensive AudioQuest Diamond USB, which was the least preferred, up against the stock USB that was the most preferred. And again, we had 38% hearing no difference. But that again tells us that 62% of people heard a difference between USB cables. So this is where, for me, it starts to get really interesting, is that these tests are proving, to me at least, that there is some difference between USB cables. And I've got further evidence coming up for that. So if you're a non-believer in USB cables making a difference to the sound, please bear with me, have an open mind, and let's have a conversation about this and just see what the data tells us, recognizing that it isn't perfect data, but it's as good as we can produce from this test. One thing that's really struck me so far is that the stock versions, the basic plain USB cables, are coming out preferred in this test. Whereas my listening test here, I don't ever find myself preferring the stock version. And I'll talk about expectation bias and the like in a moment. I can prove that it's not expectation bias, and you'll see why. But for some reason, when the recording is used, the stock USB cables are what people are preferring. On to round 4 now. We've got a pretty distinct breakdown here of 14% preferring track J, 34% on track K, but 52% hearing no difference. So this is the first time we've got a really strong leaning towards people hearing no difference. In this case, both cables were identical. Both of these were the Curious Evolved USB. So what this is showing us is that if the files are indeed identical, people are generally able to hear that they're identical. However, we do still have to acknowledge the fact that 48% of people did hear a difference, which shows us that sometimes we hear a difference because we're looking for a difference. So keep that in mind, because there is expectation bias at play whenever we do any testing like this. And so we have to take all of this data, throw it all together, and just think about what it means and break it down based on what we're seeing in the overall data set. Round 5 was the second last round, and here we had a really interesting split once again. In these tracks, what we had was the Curious Evolved USB up against the AudioQuest Diamond USB. What's curious to me about these results though is that when we put each of these cables on their own up against the stock USB cable, just the basic printer cable, the results were kind of flipped, with more people preferring the Curious Evolved cable when compared to a stock cable, and less people preferring the AudioQuest cable up against a stock cable. So when compared to stock, these results are flipped. When compared to each other, we get the results you see here. Once again, we need to acknowledge that there are a significant number of people who heard no difference. And so that tells us that the difference between these cables is subtle, and there's a few things going on when it comes to listening to USB cables that change how people hear them. One of them, as I've already mentioned, is the system, and the other part of it is people's ability or knowledge of what they're actually listening for. And I don't mean that they're listening expecting to hear differences. I mean listening to the music through a number of different internal analyses, you could say. So there's the tonal qualities, there's the spatial qualities, there's the transients, there's the decay of notes. All of these different factors can be the different things that change, but if you're not used to and practiced at listening to all of them, it's very easy to not hear differences. And now on to round 6. This was very much a control round and provided some really fascinating data to me that I can't completely explain. So we had 45% of people preferring track N. So there's a really significant number of people have lent towards track N as their preference. That left 27% on track O and 28% hearing no difference. What's fascinating about this test though is that most people preferred the recorded version of the music. So in this situation I had the original file, which I had then volume matched as best I could to a version that was recorded using the same setup as I used for all the other tests. So played back through the Chord Hugo TT2 and the M scaler and recorded on the Zoom H1N. I found it fascinating that most people preferred the recorded version, which when you listen to them live in the same room, so i.e. directly from the TT2 versus the recording, there is no doubt which one sounds better. The Zoom H1N is definitely compressing some of the details. It's not as good of a sound quality as you get for the original. And so it says to me that either something is going on in the way it's compressing it that people are enjoying, and I should add that I'm using the term compression not in the sense of compression like a mastering engineer or producer might do, but just generally compressing in terms of losing some of the size and space in the soundstage, the overall details, etc. The end result from the recording is less fully realized, I guess you could say, than what I hear when I play back the same content directly into my headphones, as in from the computer to the TT2 and into my headphones. So my other thought here is that there could have been some level issues. As I said, I tried to volume match these as closely as possible, but I didn't want to manipulate the file too heavily, and so it was done by eye, rather than any normalizing algorithms or software that may have also altered the waveforms. The other thing that's possible is that in some cases, depending on the software you're using, the original file, despite having been renamed in the file name, may have come up tagged, and that may have changed people's perception one way or the other of what they were listening to. So there were a few little flaws here, but the key thing here for me was that again, there were a large number of people that heard differences between these files. So where does this leave us? Ultimately, it tells us the recording process did affect the results, because when we are presenting music that is notably inferior and more people are preferring it, it says something's affected this process. The other thing that that's telling me is that there are some people who, because of their systems, their ability to listen critically to music, and I don't mean to knock anybody when I say that, it's a practice thing that there are actually people that go and learn how to listen to music to be testers and product developers at companies because it is a skill. So I don't knock anybody when I say that some people didn't necessarily know how to listen critically. And this all plays in to the relevance of this review in a moment. There are so many factors that go into whether or not a USB cable can make a difference, whether or not you're going to hear the difference. All of these factors play into this. And so this data is very much about showing that we can hear differences. We've demonstrated here with the control test where people didn't hear a difference versus the test of the upsampled files where people did hear a difference versus the original file version where people did hear a difference versus the Curious cable and the AudioQuest cable where people did hear a difference. So we had multiple tests here where people did hear differences between cables. I'm not for a second going to suggest that this data is conclusive, that it's a complete scientific study or anything like that. It is a flawed test. I'm very upfront and open about that, but I think it starts the conversation off nicely to show that there is a possibility, a strong possibility, that there are differences to be heard. So with that data in mind and acknowledging the flaws, let's talk a little bit about the theory of why and how a USB cable could actually make a difference. Now, if you're a USB cable non-believer, do please try and hear me out, have an open mind, and let's talk this through. And then I'm more than happy for you to make up your mind either way. But just hear the theory behind this, because I've done a lot of research and a lot of listening, and I believe there is merit to what I'm about to say. The theory of those that say that USB cables can make no difference is based on the fact that USB cables are carrying a digital signal. And yes, that's true. It is a digital audio signal, or a set of data that represents a digital audio signal. The thing that's often missed in these arguments though, is that that signal is not transmitted as an actual digital signal. What it is a series of voltages swinging between a high and a low level of voltage that delineate a 1 for the high voltage and a 0 for the low voltage. That's actually no different to any other analog cable. So if you think about your RCA or your XLR cables, they are working in exactly the same way. It's a series of fluctuating voltages over a period of time carrying through the cable. There's more variation in interconnects because the voltages can vary drastically over the course of a piece of music. But in the case of a USB cable, it's still carrying an analog signal, which is a series of fluctuating voltages. Another argument that often comes up in the USB debate is the fact that USB uses data checking. In other words, the receiver checks the data that's arriving and is able to feed back to the source, the computer, and say, hey, this data is wrong, please resend that packet. That's very true if you're talking about data transfers of files across to a hard drive or information going to a printer, but in the case of audio, that's actually not true. What's happening in an audio signal is that the data is being sent, received, and produced by the DAC instantly as it receives the signal. That's because music is very time sensitive and therefore there is no availability for the DAC to receive the information, do error checking, and request a new packet of data. You'd end up with all sorts of stopping and starting and stuttering of your music, and it just wouldn't be listenable. So all USB products are designed in such a way that the data is sent by the computer with no data checking and requesting of fresh data if there's errors. There is no error checking, so it doesn't even know if there's errors coming. It produces whatever it receives. So with those two pieces of knowledge in mind, that firstly it's a fluctuating voltage, it's an analog signal essentially. So it's an analog signal conveying digital information. So that's the first fact that we need to know. The second fact is what I just said, there is no error checking going on. Then the third thing that we need to know is that we're working in a relatively small voltage range. I've done a range of reading and I've seen some different figures, but ultimately based on everything I've read, USB is based on very small voltage fluctuations in the range of millivolts. So let's say your DAC is receiving a signal that goes up to plus 300 millivolts and down to 0 millivolts, and that's the range of the signal for this example. Within that range, the DAC will be designed that over a certain threshold, it knows is a 1 in the digital data, and below that threshold is a 0. Now, all things being equal, it should be nice and easy that if it hits 300 millivolts, the DAC easily knows that it's a 1. If it drops down to 0 millivolts, it knows it's a 0. The problem is that all electronics, including cables, don't change voltages instantly. There is a ramp up and a ramp down time, and that's caused by things such as capacitance and inductance. So there are different issues going on in terms of the metallurgy of the cables, the interaction between different components that will actually delay the signal by very, very small amounts, but those very small amounts make a difference. And the reason they make a difference is because if your DAC is looking for a sample at a particular moment in time and the signal coming through the cable is still ramping up to hit that 300 millivolt peak, the DAC might sample at a moment where the cable is stuck still changing voltage, and therefore the DAC may get a reading that is either right on the threshold or just below the threshold or above the threshold when it should be on the other side. If we add into that the fact that it's an analog signal and therefore prone to things like radio frequency and electromagnetic radiation, not to mention the power cable that runs through it from the computer, which is notoriously noisy, all of this noise can further muddy the waters by bringing additional millivolts into the picture. So let's say, for instance, the cable is ramping down to 0 volts, and let's say it's only just past the threshold, but at the same time, there's some RF noise which bumps that voltage back up. Now all of a sudden, the USB receives a positive signal by a matter of a couple of millivolts instead of a 0. That's not going to cause enough of a noise for us to perceive clicks or pops, but it's going to mess with the waveform and result in a less realistic rendering of the music. If that happens, let's say even a few times every second, you're going to start to hear music that's not as clean and crisp as it should be. So without getting further into the engineering side of this, because I'm not qualified for that and I'm the first one to declare it, what I can tell you is that all the reading I've done says that USB cables make a difference in the same way that coaxial cables make a difference, XLR cables make a difference, RCA cables make a difference. All of these cables are carrying analog signals. They are analog, sometimes carrying a digital set of data, but it's in an analog waveform. So if we acknowledge that it's an analog waveform and therefore is prone to the issues with analog waveforms in terms of inductance, capacitance, those little timing errors that get produced by that, external noise sources such as radio frequency and EMI, once we acknowledge that, it starts to make sense that a USB cable actually could make a difference. So with all that in mind, hopefully you're still with me and you've got an open mind at this point. Let's talk about the Curious Evolved USB. I'm sitting here now, it's actually the end of my recording of this review, and I've come back around because I need to say something. This is the first time this has happened in a review for me, and so I wanted to share the process that I've just gone through in recording the review and changing my mind midway through. And I want to explain why I've changed it. I'm recording this insert at the end of my recording process because I want to encourage you to watch all the way through to the end. You see, what's happened in this review is as I've gone through, something dawned on me as a better way to test than comparing USB cables with USB cables. I wanted to work out which one was the most accurate representation of the signal, and I believe I've discovered the answer in the context of the cables I'm looking at in this review. So do make sure you stay through to the end. I'm going to say some things along the way that I've already recorded that I actually disagree with come the very end of the process. So stick with me, keep an open mind, and hopefully at the end you'll understand why I've added this bit in. Curious Cables is a company run by a fellow Australian called Rob Woodland. Rob contacted me a while ago and asked me if I'd be interested in reviewing the Curious Evolved USB. The Curious USB cable has been around for quite some time now. I heard one years back fairly early in my journey in HeadFi. So I was keen to have a look at where it had evolved to in the Curious Evolved, which yes is called that because it's an evolution of the original. The Evolved cable retails for $550 for a 0.8 meter cable. It's also available in longer lengths if you want to, but I'm going to work with the 0.8 meter pricing here for the other comparisons I'm going to talk about because I think it's a good practical length for a USB cable. So for $550, some of you might have fallen out of your chair right now thinking, oh my God, I can't believe you'd spend that on a USB cable. And yes, it is a lot of money to spend on a USB cable. So that begs the question, is it worth it? And does it make a big difference? The data's already proven that it can make a difference. So the big question for me was not whether or not it does make a difference, but whether or not it makes a good difference and a good improvement to the sound. Before I answer that exact question, let's talk about the cable itself. So these are essentially a handmade cable as I understand it, and they're the result of Rob putting in hours and hours and actually months and months in the original version of work to work out what sounded best for USB cables. This has been a bit of a passion of his where he went on a journey trying all different conductor materials, cable layouts, you name it, to find the best sounding cable for his tastes. The end result in the case of the Evolved has a very similar design to the original Curious. You've got very simple plugs at each end, so there's nothing fancy going on here, there's no special engraving or anything like that. They're a very basic plug connected to a cable that is in all ways shielded, so I don't know what is actually going on inside. But importantly, what's going on at the outside here, you can probably see this orange cable. This is the power lead, the 5-volt power lead. If you've watched any of my reviews of things like the Topping P50 power supply, the Shit Modius, I talked about this, the Topping D10S, I spoke about it. The 5-volt power supply through USBs coming from a computer is notoriously dirty and noisy. So by having this external lead, which I believe is a coaxial cable, which means that that power supply is actually shielded within the cable itself to prevent the noise getting out of that coaxial and into the USB data leads. So inside the sheathing is all of your data, outside is your power. Beyond that, it all looks pretty simple. Based on the stiffness of it, it feels to me like a solid core conductor has been used, which is great. Solid core, in my experience, no matter what data or information it's carrying, is generally preferable to a stranded cable. And so that's really all there is to know about the Curious Evolved. It's very simple, it looks good, it feels nice, and it does the job. The big question, of course, though, is yes, it does the job, but as it does the job, how does it sound? I was originally hoping to have some answers to that question based on the mystery tests, but once I realized what the recorder was doing to the sound quality, it became a test of can we hear the differences, not which one is better, which one is worse, because sadly the recorder muddied those waters too badly. So on this one, you are going to have to rely on my opinion and what I've heard, but I'll try and explain as clearly as I can the differences between the cables. So to do this test for myself, I set up with 3 different cables. A stock plain basic USB cable, the Curious Evolved USB cable here, and an AudioQuest Diamond USB cable. The AudioQuest Diamond USB cable retails for $650 for a 0.75 meter cable. AudioQuest have all of their own fancy technologies in there, and I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of the AudioQuest design here, but I did once upon a time do a full write-up of the AudioQuest USB cable range with comparisons between all of them. So I'll link that down below. You can click through and have a read if you're interested. And what you'll hear me talk about here today reaffirms something that I said in that USB write-up and confirms that there is not expectation bias going on here. And let me share this now to get it out of the way nice and early. I threw an extra cable into the mix at the very end that I don't have full comparison notes on, but once I'd finished all my listening, I wanted to decide which cable was I going to install back in my system as my go-to cable for the TT2 and the M scaler. And the result was that I chose the cheapest of the three cables, not including the stock cable, the cheapest of the three aftermarket cables that I have here. So if I was hearing expectation bias, my expectations would be that the most expensive cable would be the best sounding cable. When in reality, I've preferred the least expensive of the three, and it is still an expensive cable, but the least expensive of the three I have preferred over the two more expensive cables. So keep that in mind. There is not expectation bias playing out here because I've actually preferred something that is worth less and therefore should sound not as good. With that out of the way, let's talk about what I actually heard. Consistently, when I listened to the Curious cable against the stock cable, what I was hearing was a sound that had more three-dimensionality, better note weight, so the presence of each of the individual notes and sounds was more realistic and more solid, and everything was smoother but not losing any detail in being smoother. So all the detail was there, it was just more kind of refined sounding, if you like. The separation of individual sounds was consistently better, and the sense of overall clarity in the music was improved a little bit as well. So there was no doubt in my mind that the Evolved consistently delivered a better sound quality than the stock USB cable. Once I determined that the Evolved cable was significantly better than the stock cable, the biggest test for me was to see how it compared to something as expensive and flagship level as the AudioQuest Diamond. So I ran through a series of 4 tracks, and I've produced a playlist of these so you can listen to them for yourself and have a listen to what I'm about to describe using your own systems. I started off with Can't Shake It by Kate Miller-Heidke, and I hope I'm saying that right. When listening to that, what I found was that the Curious cable was smoother, it had that great sense of space and separation. The Diamond, on the other hand, had a more etched sound. Everything was a little bit more defined, for better or worse, and that's going to be a big thing that you're going to notice as I talk about these. I'm not necessarily ever going to say one's better than the other. They're different is probably what I'd have to say. And so as I listened to Can't Shake It, what I found was that the layering of the sounds was different between the two cables. Both were good, both were way, way better than the stock cable, but as to which one I preferred, it was really hard to say, and in fact I never came to a conclusion. I just wrote down that the layering was different. So straight away what I started to see was that between those two cables, it's going to be probably a question of preference as to which one you choose. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the rest of the examples to hopefully clarify for you which cables are going to suit which sort of systems and which sort of sound preferences. Next up was Straight for the Knife by Sia from the 1000 Forms of Fear album. What I found from the Curious cable was that it had a better note weight here, and I've already mentioned that, but it was clear and evident once again in Sia's vocals. Her voice had three-dimensionality and presence using the Curious cable that the stock cable didn't. But then when I moved to the Diamond cable, I actually found I was hearing and understanding the vocals more clearly. It seemed to me that the Diamond cable had slightly thinner or lighter bass response, but it might have been that I was getting more texture coming through up top that was just adding extra information that made me perceive it as lighter, because I don't necessarily think it was making that much of a difference to the bass levels coming out. So the frequency response was probably not changing drastically so much as the masking effect of hearing extra sounds that I wasn't necessarily hearing with the Evolved. That may sound like I'm saying definitively that the Diamond was extracting information that the Evolved wasn't, but that's not what I'm saying. My point here is that the two different cables bring a degree of emphasis of different frequencies or different presentation styles that changes my perception of the music when listening to them. That raises a fascinating question, which is, if this is meant to be passing on digital data, if you're getting that data right, it should have the right sound. So when we've got different cables bringing different slight colorations to the sound, it does raise a troublesome question, which is which coloration was correct. If the data is coming through perfectly, there should be no coloration, there should just be perfect clarity. So let's continue on and see what the other example showed us and see if we can come to some sort of conclusion. The next track up was Noam Chomsky is a Soft Revolution by Foy Vance. And once again, I found the Diamond pulled ahead a little bit on detail and resolution and clarity, while the Evolved still had that nice smooth sound with great separation and space, but just didn't have the sense of detail that I was finding from the Diamond. Both were again vastly superior to the stock cable in every sense. So I could have stopped there, but I did the last track that I had in my playlist, which was Elijah Rock by Harry Connick Jr. And I'm so glad I continued on, because all of a sudden hearing this track, the Evolved pulled ahead for me of the AudioQuest Diamond. What I heard on this track was preferable note weight from the Evolved compared to the Diamond. So things like the piano, the brass, the drums, everything had a better sense of presence and weight when I listened to the Evolved compared to the Diamond, which at times came across just a little bit edgy. And this was about the time I suddenly realized that these two USB cables, the Diamond and the Evolved, are going to be a matter of preference and system setup. They're not going to be a case of one being definitively better than the other. At this point, you might be thinking that the AudioQuest Diamond is the best cable there is, and that's just the one to buy. But what dawned on me was that time and time again, these were subjective decisions I was making as to which sound I preferred. Once I hit Elijah Rock and realized that on that particular track I preferred a different USB cable, it suddenly started to trouble me that all I was doing here was talking about preferences based on tracks, and that is a recipe for disaster. The problem is when you start to set up positive or negative synergies between equipment and music that you're listening to as tests, you're going to potentially run into problems when you have other recordings that are recorded differently. So in other words, out of the 4 tracks I'd selected for this test, 3 of them happen to suit the AudioQuest Diamond. But what if 80% of my listening catalogue happens to suit the Curious Evolved better? So where all this led me to was that everything so far has been a subjective decision on my part as to which one sounds better. And that approach to me is fraught with danger, because it's coming down to my preferences right at this point in time, and also based on the music I've listened to. So what I wanted to do was try to work out if both cables are lending some sort of tonal differences, tonal changes to the music, which one is actually correct? And how do we know which one is correct? It's a little bit troublesome that a USB cable that is meant to be conveying digital information could be altering the sound in terms of its tonality. It's one thing to clean up jitter and clean up interference, but it's a whole other thing to change the tonal character of the sound. So the question for me was, out of the AudioQuest Diamond and the Curious Evolved USB, which of those two is actually the truest representation of the digital signal? To work that out, I had to turn to another format, being optical. While optical may have some of its own drawbacks that I'm not going to go into here, the benefit of optical is that it's not an analog waveform, so it's not susceptible to EMI, RF noise, there's no 5-volt power feed. Everything about it makes it more likely to be correctly transmitting the digital signal as it comes from the source. So as my final test in this process, I hooked up the M Scaler and the TT2, playing back from Roon and using a Raspberry Pi 3 with a high quality Digi Plus board from Hi-Fi Berry as a source for my optical feed. So I was able to run USB from the computer and optical from the Raspberry Pi at exactly the same time, playing exactly the same track and feeding into the M Scaler. From there, I did a couple of rounds of testing using the Curious Evolved cable at one stage and the AudioQuest Diamond at the other. And my final conclusion was that the Curious Evolved USB cable was clearly and easily the more tonally accurate sound. Now, once again, I find it slightly disturbing that USB cables are changing the tonal qualities of the digital signal. Cleaning it up so that there's no jitter, there's no noise, there's no interference, that's one thing, but adjusting the tonal qualities is a little bit of a concern. You may notice in these last few minutes of recording that the Curious Evolved is now missing from my desk. The reason for that is that, having heard what I've heard tonight, it's staying in my system connected to the M Scaler and the TT2. Without a doubt now, having done the comparison with optical, the Curious Evolved USB cable is the best USB cable I've heard. It's not always the one that I would choose subjectively listening to different tracks, but sadly that's a result of the tracks suiting a certain cable, not the fact that the cable is doing a better job at transmitting the digital signal. I find it interesting that in the mystery test results, the curious cable versus the stock cable test was actually the one that people were least likely to hear the differences between the cables. That to me is actually now in hindsight a sign that the curious USB cable was better and more authentically transmitting the correct digital signal. In other words, it wasn't changing the tonal character of the sound, and it shouldn't because it's a digital signal, it was just more faithfully transmitting the signal. Now again, the recorder compressed the differences that you were able to hear, but the tonality still came through. And so this initial test that I originally thought was a bit of a wash has possibly actually been the most important one. Now of course, if you want to tweak your system and deliberately bring a bit more edge and energy to it, you might go out there and choose an AudioQuest Diamond USB. But if you're looking for the cable that is the most authentic representation of the digital signal, whilst also improving the transmission of it so that any noise, any interference, any of those things that get in the way of perfect transmission are taken away, then the Curious Evolved USB is the one to buy. I've been through quite a journey on this review, and in my first round before I did the optical testing, I'd actually come to prefer the AudioQuest Coffee USB cable, which is cheaper than both the Diamond and the Curious. And indeed, I would probably still choose the Coffee over and above the Diamond, which goes to show that expectation bias is not what's going on here. I prefer the sound of the Coffee despite it costing less than both the Evolved and the Diamond. However, if we're talking about true to the original source, which is what I actually want my USB cable to be doing, then the Evolved wins hands down between all three of those. So expectation bias is out the window. It's not the most expensive cable that's won. It's also not the most marketed and well branded cable that's won. It's the one that sounds the most like the optical signal when I listen to them side by side. I want to say a huge thanks to Rob Woodland for sending me the Curious cable. It's now going to be a prized possession in my system because I love the fact that it brings that extra sense of depth and realism and space to the music without affecting the tonal qualities of it. This has been quite a fascinating journey for me, having been through lots of different USB cable testing over the years, including the write-up that I mentioned and I'll link down below. I've heard lots of USB cables, I've tried lots of different approaches to digital audio, but I've never quite had the experience I did tonight of hearing just how much of a difference tonally USB cables can make, and therefore asking the question of which one is the most accurate and correct. So Rob, thank you for the opportunity, I really do appreciate it. For everybody watching, if you're in the market for a USB cable, as I said before, don't rush out and buy an expensive one if your system is still at an entry level, but certainly if you're at a point where you feel like you've got all the other pieces in place and you're looking for that last one or two pieces to the puzzle, the Curious Evolved USB cable is an absolute must consideration. There are other great USB cables out there, but based on my testing tonight, I'm yet to hear one that performs as well as the Curious Evolved. Hopefully I haven't infuriated anybody with this review. I hope you found it interesting and informative. If you have, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment down below if you've got something to share. But for now, I'll leave you to it. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.